Welcome back to the history of everything, I guess. We have already discussed the fall of Constantinople in a three-part series, starting with the actual fall, giving you a general understanding, along with the prelude and the actual order of battle and how the fall actually happened. But I wanted to take a different route. Actually, it was more of a suggestion from my dad. It was based on hypothetical, because we're both history nerds, obviously. And one of the things, we had this thought experiment rather, how basically a lot of things that we take for granted in today's world happened because of the fall of Constantinople. It was like this major flashpoint, if you can even call it that. For example, the discovery of the Americas, it only happened the moment it happened because basically European powers were trying to circumnavigate the globe to get around the Ottoman Empire so they wouldn't have to pay tariffs and taxes. And obviously, we can't talk about the fall of Constantinople without talking about the Renaissance that followed because of the many Byzantine Greeks that fled Constantinople and basically moved mostly to Italy, especially Venice and Genoa, and started basically teaching in universities, talking about the arts, bringing ancient Greek knowledge with them, especially Platonism. So it really got me thinking about everything that we take for granted in today's world. And it led me to a very, how should I call it, schizophrenic rabbit hole. The reason I call this rabbit hole schizophrenic isn't because I just want to be funny, it's because given what we know today in our history books, it sounds completely far-fetched, but given what was available at the time, it actually makes a lot of sense. And it led me to the conclusion that basically the United States of America would still have existed, but with a Xi Jinping type of character in charge of it. Basically, where I'm getting at is that China, especially more specifically the Ming Dynasty and the subsequent states that followed, would be the ones to colonize the New World, but they would probably take a different direction, and it will all make sense. For a little bit of context, back in the 15th century, if you asked anyone, not just in Europe, but in Eurasia as a whole, and you ask them, let's say that there is a new gigantic landmass on the other side of the planet, who would be the first to discover it? 9 times out of 10, they probably would have said the Chinese, and that would be because they were the only ones that had a strong enough centralized form of government, whereas Europe, especially at the time, was a complete mess of battling states, fiefdoms, dukedoms, what have you, basically fighting against each other to the point where even the Pope, who was supposed to be this larger unifying factor, could not even bring them together when we were facing, as Europe basically, the existential threat that was the Ottoman Empire. So, for this thought experiment to work, there are some things in our timeline that we take for granted that wouldn't have taken place or would have gone completely different. The way that I wanted to start out my thought experiment was with, first of all, the Battle of Varna being a Christian success rather than an Ottoman one. The Hundred-Year War basically ending significantly faster. The Reconquista succeeding also faster than, and also significantly before the fall, the time in which the fall of Constantinople would have taken place, and basically the most important part, and I'm gonna get a lot of hatred from my fellow Greeks for this, the anti-unionists basically bending the knee to the Pope. Hear me out, this is very important. We all know how the Council of Florence was signed between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, basically with the two churches coming back into communion and recognizing once again the Pope as the head of the Christian Church. But unfortunately, a lot of Western Europeans did not trust the Greeks, and with very good reason, especially because of individuals like Gennadius Calarius, Lucas Taras, and so on and so forth. But even before that, Mark of Ephesus, that's a completely different story, and there are some excellent both Catholic and Orthodox theologians that go into depth. This is not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is create the hypothetical framework for the defense of Constantinople to go completely the way the Paleologi dynasty wanted it to happen. The things that I'm going to say are based on estimates that were given by accounts of the time. For example, during the time of the fall of Constantinople, the number of military-aged men that chose not to fight against the Ottomans, basically because of their anti-unionist stance, was estimated anywhere between 7,000 and 35,000. Obviously, I'm willing to accept that 35,000 is a bit of a stretch, obviously, and the number is going to be closer to 7,000. Now, if you watched my previous videos, and if you haven't, go watch them, the city was defended by a grand total, if you can even call it grand, of 8,000 soldiers. Let's say that you added another 7,000, you almost double it. Now, let's also make the Eastern Romans a more reliable ally. That would garner at least another 3,000 troops in order to fight the Ottomans. This would increase the fighting chances significantly. Keep in mind, in our timeline already, Mehmed was close to calling it quits so he could regroup. Imagine if he had to fight a significantly larger force. He would definitely have to basically go back and try to rethink his strategy. However, additional support would come from the West because, again, the Byzantine Empire is a significantly more reliable ally. And as it happened in the past with Michael VIII Palaeologos, the Eastern Roman Empire is able to get its land back, especially in the historical heartland, the Greek-speaking heartland rather, of basically what is modern-day Greece and the shore of Asia Minor, Pontus, and ideally, in that scenario, maybe they would try and get some parts of northern Epirus, but I think that's kind of a stretch. Obviously, in this scenario, Europe doesn't have a need to basically try and circumnavigate the globe, so they wouldn't go around Africa, so there wouldn't be a precise map with the outline of Africa for a very long time. The Americas wouldn't have been discovered in the 15th century, and what would have happened, at least in my opinion, the Ming Dynasty would have been able to conquer the New World, but not through North America or through the Caribbean. Instead, they would probably go through Australia because Taiwan. In this hypothetical scenario, our hero would be one Admiral Yu Daoyu, who was one of China's most important and skilled maritime figures, often fighting off pirates in the southeast on around the Sea of Taiwan. Now, in our timeline already, China has already been trading with the Philippines and basically the southeast. So that would not be that weird for them to reach these places, especially since they are significantly closer to the New World, especially parts of Australia and Polynesia than mainland China is. So, in this scenario, Yu Daoyu manages to reach not just Manila, but also accidentally because even in our scenario, America was discovered accidentally. He would accidentally land on the northern coast of Australia. He would make contact with the Aborigines, and obviously, even though China was in a strict isolationist period, it would probably make the government reconsider its policy and try to create new trading routes, because obviously trading has always been one of the main ways in which governments make money. So because things happen a little bit later in our timeline, uh, the same thing is going to happen with the discovery of America. So in our timeline, Christopher Columbus lands on America, or rather the Caribbean, in 1492. So let's say that UW lands in Australia at around 1530. Since Australia in our timeline was discovered in 1606 by the British, it would only make sense if America itself was discovered in 1650, the earliest, by the Chinese. I mean, again, much like in our timeline, the Chinese would have to deal with the same kind of things that the British and the French had to deal with their colonies, wanting to gain independence, but it would happen significantly later and would be more of a, rather than Britain and USA kind of situation, would probably kind of be more like offshoots going on. Not necessarily like mainland China, excuse me, and Taiwan, but somewhere more along the lines of, I don't know if it even makes sense the way I'm going to say it, but mainland China and Singapore. So yeah, this is my idea of how things would have worked on the Asian side had the Ottoman Empire never conquered the Eastern Romans. Now, going back to Europe for a little bit, I did mention that the Renaissance basically did happen because Greek Byzantine refugees fled the Ottoman Empire and went to Italy. Now, because the city of Constantinople never falls in this timeline, there would be no immediate reason for people to flee Constantinople and move to Italy. Instead, what would have happened? Uh, Obviously, trade relations between the Eastern Romans and the Venetians would have improved, probably making not only Constantinople but also Thessaloniki one of the most important trading cities in the old world, because even in today's timeline, it's the perfect city if you want to connect Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean to Central Europe. It's a very important hub, and it would only make sense, financially speaking, if both the Byzantines and the Venetians helped basically raise it up. Now, I did mention the Renaissance happening. Now, it might sound the way I'm saying it that I don't believe that the Renaissance would have happened the same way that it did, which is partially untrue because parts of the Renaissance were happening long before the fall of Constantinople. For example, one of the most famous philosophers of the Byzantine Empire was George Plethon Gemistos, who was one of the first. He was not necessarily a paganist, but he was one of the very first people in medieval Greece to basically call himself not just a Greek, but a Hellene. Keep in mind, up until that point in the Eastern Roman Empire, if you called yourself a Hellene, meaning an ethnic Greek, it meant that you identified as a pagan. So yeah, people like that did exist. They did study the classics. They did study not just Greek classics, but also Roman classics, which helped. usher in the new era of the Renaissance. Now, obviously, in our timeline, it would have happened a little bit later. I would probably guess somewhere between 50 and 70 years. Now, I don't have much to base this on. It's more of a hunch because there is no immediate need for the scholars to move to the West. So it would only make sense that this kind of thinking would naturally go westward a little bit later on in this timeline. Obviously, in this timeline, I did mention that there would be reconciliation between the anti-unionists and the pro-unionists, therefore leading once again to a unified Christian church. Now, this doesn't mean that there would be no hardliners. Obviously, there still would be, but they probably would have been in the minority. And this is highly speculative. I could be completely wrong, but they would probably be dealt as a form of high church Protestants in our timeline. They would be pretty much seen as Lutherans before Martin Luther, with actual apostolic succession. One final thing that I want to talk about in this timeline would be a potential industrial revolution. Obviously, whenever there's trade, whenever there's commerce, there is always a need to produce goods faster, better, and more reliably, and to basically streamline processes. My idea would be that it still would have happened around the same time as our Industrial Revolution did in the 19th century, but it would have been significantly more decentralized, meaning that instead of it happening only around the main colonial power, or rather powers, which in this timeline would be basically China and whichever East Asian polity would be competing with, it still would have happened in Europe simultaneously but semi-independently, because there has already been a large tradition of Europeans making machines, of creating things, especially, for example, since it has been happening during the times of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, so it would be nothing new. So yeah, this has been the history of everything, I guess. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment. And if you really enjoy my work, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon to help me make more videos in the future.